The departure of Arnold Walter was a heavy blow to the staff of Perry Memorial Hospital and the community. His work at the hospital had earned him the highest regard.
Well, Arnold Walter was, I never heard a bad thing about Arnold Walter. The guy was incredible. He was sort of the grandfather of the hospital.
I think he probably would have worked longer, except he was so ill by the time he was maybe 60. He was so sick that I'm sure the board, somebody said, we got to have a good succession plan in place here.
Leadership of Perry Memorial Hospital would now fall to Mr. Walter's assistant, Harold Gable. Unlike Mr. Walter, Gable had spent years being groomed to lead a hospital. The previous decades had been a lesson to hospitals across the country, and Gable was part of the emerging wave of trained healthcare leaders. For Perry Memorial Hospital, the storm of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s had passed. A period of growth was just beginning, and Harold Gable was ready to continue the progress started under his predecessor. In 1969, Perry Memorial Hospital's first intensive care unit opened in the new hospital building. The increased space from the new building meant a myriad of new services would open to the community. More services also meant more employees, along with more management, and more effort needed to keep the staff up to date, professional, and happy. Mr. Gable knew the organization of the hospital needed to shift. Healthcare was growing more complex, so did the demands on the leadership.
I started at Perry in 1966. The administrators, when I came to the hospital, we had three people. We had an administrator, you had a CPA, which was a second, and you had the head of the nursing. Okay, those were your three.
Gable convinced the board to create a series of new management positions. Duncan Bryant, who had managed all financial affairs since 1947, was promoted to Director of Fiscal Services.
Duncan Bryant was the gentleman's gentleman, and he was just a little guy with glasses and a pencil. We would do our budgets, and Duncan would scotch tape together 16 sheets of ledger paper, and we'd roll this thing out on a big table down in the cafeteria usually, and he had his budget on this huge spreadsheet. I mean, this was the original spreadsheet, and we would sit there and I would say, well, Duncan, what would happen if we would increase our patient days by 2%? And he'd get out his eraser and he'd scratch out things all the way from the top of that 16 pages down to the bottom, changing them. I mean, that's the way it worked. Duncan was just amazing.
Other director positions followed. For the first time, leading the hospital would take more than 2 or 3 people. The other area of growth came from volunteers. By 1970, the auxiliary had grown to more than 1,000 members.
I mean, they were really involved in a whole bunch of things having to do with patients. But keep in mind, those are the times when the CEO was delivering the newspaper to people's lives. I mean, it was a different environment. The average length of stay was 14 days. So you had the ladies going around with the flowers, taking care of the flowers for the patients. You had other ladies going around with the little books on a cart, and they'd go in. You had the auxiliary was everywhere.
Members dedicated countless hours to the Candy Cane Bazaar and used donations to award scholarships to local graduates in the name of the late Abby Jean Gunning. Once again, a new building allowed a new opportunity for the gift shop. Now newly located inside of the 1969 hospital entrance, the gift shop had come a long way from 1953, when everything for sale could fit on the top of a desk. Year after year, the auxiliary donated equipment that went beyond the annual budget. In 1973, Harold Gable resigned as administrator and was succeeded by Harold Autry.
He was way overeducated. He'd been to these prestigious universities. He had a boatload of experience before he came to Princeton. And I asked him, I said, what brought you here? Is this a missionary thing for you or what? And he would say, I just always wanted to work in a small hospital. I'd never done it before. He taught me more things than I could ever imagine.
Hal's first challenge would be the old buildings. Soon after arriving, the fire marshal officially condemned the original buildings. It would be far too costly to bring them up to code. Hal recommended that they be torn down and replaced. The first step would be to make sure there would be enough room for patients in the meantime.
We had a 100-bed hospital. It overflowed many times. I can remember when they came and put 8 beds in the hallway. They ran a 90 out of 100 most of the time. It was busy.
When I started, we had 136 beds. We often had patients in the halls because we didn't have enough rooms for patients. The average length of stay was like 15 days. The average length of stay for obstetrics was 8 days.
I remember Mom saying, well, yeah, you stayed 10 days because supposedly on the 9th day everything went back in place. I said, well, okay. But can you imagine? I can't imagine not being up and moving for that many days. You really would not be able to move.
A heart attack at that time, you were in for 30 days, the hospital.
You're expected to go to ICU and lay very quietly in the dark, not even raise your head. I mean, it was that kind of atmosphere.
You had the family doctors, and then you had the surgeon, and you had the pathologist, radiologist, and the anesthesia people. Okay, that's all you needed.
I don't remember that we transferred that many patients, and to go to Peoria to the hospital then was just a huge deal.
They had nothing to offer, technically wise, that we had.
At the time, OSF hadn't really developed a very good community interpersonal relationship with satellite communities. Not in the sense of the hospital administration. They welcomed, obviously, every single case they could get. But some of the orthopedics, the eye doctors, some of them, it was almost like they were resentful, particularly since all of them at that time were independent.
The empty third floor of the 1969 edition was so far nothing more than untapped potential.
When I started there, you would take the elevator up to the third floor, the door would open, and it was a big, vast expanse of nothing but concrete up there. You could see the footprints in the concrete where the workers, I guess, earlier had just, in 69, had left, and they didn't even smooth the concrete behind their feet. They were still in the concrete.
Hal convinced the board to finish the third floor of the hospital as soon as possible. By 1976, the third floor was opened for surgical patients, adding more than 50 beds. The next step was to replace the old buildings. There was enough room, if needed, for nearly 200 patients, so overcrowding was becoming less of a problem. Instead, what was lacking was office space. The number of administrators and support staff, as well as outpatient services, were growing along with the complexities of Medicare and insurance providers. Office space was needed now more than ever, and Hal soon came up with a revolutionary solution. He envisioned a large office building that would replace the private doctors' offices scattered across the area and entice more to come.
There was Dr. Rathbun, George Rathbun. He was there in Princeton, a general practitioner. And Dr. James Forsman, he was a general practitioner. Then there was Dr. Kowalski, Julius Kowalski, and they were the big general practitioners at the time. And this is before the advent of family practice as a specialty.
I don't remember any of them having offices at the hospital. They're just, they had them elsewhere.
Well, there were many guys around that were practicing out of their house at that time, some of the older
Right.
GPs.
There was 2 or 3 primary care doctors, GPs, on the staff in the late 70s, early 80s who were just way, way overworked. And you have to remember that was the time when the primary care physicians covered the emergency room. So you could literally be up 24 hours a day trying to make a living doing your private practice and then taking calls in the emergency room at night. It could get pretty onerous.
The patients didn't call the hospital if they had a problem. They called their doctor. Okay, we'd answer our phone anytime at home. So the doctor would go and do whatever he did for that or any other disease.
And then there was senior Dr. Nelson, K.M. Nelson, and his son, K. Dexter Nelson. Dexter was probably the most intelligent, most articulate person I ever met.
We didn't have heart transplants, lung transplants. If you really had a bad heart attack, we'd call the internist, Dr. Nelson's son. And so you would call him if you weren't too sure of what you had to do for whatever, then you'd call the internist.
He sort of ushered in a wave of healthcare from, I'd say, post-World War II to the 1960s, late 60s. I mean, it was him that pushed and got things moving. There was no ICU before Dexter. We knew we couldn't recruit more doctors unless we had an office building attached to the hospital. The new doctors were telling us, we don't want an office 5 miles away, where we're spending all our time on the road between the hospital and our office. We want something that's connected so we can have immediate access to our hospital patients.
Hal knew the building could give the hospital a head start on the transition towards outpatient services and would help make Perry Memorial Hospital the true center of care for the surrounding communities.
It was obvious to us that we were, at that point, changing from this pure inpatient model to something that was more outpatient related. Nobody paid attention to the outpatients. We knew that was our future.
As drawings for the new facility came together, the old buildings were torn apart. The 3 buildings that had been the face of healthcare in Princeton for nearly 60 years were no more. In their place would be the new ambulatory care facility. Most of the project was made possible from federal loans and grants.
We used a lot of grant money to build that thing, federal grant money. And one time he and I were looking over some grant applications, and we noticed that the word ambulatory kept popping up on there. And it was kind of a buzzword the feds were using. And so we discovered that if we called the building ambulatory, we get more money for it. All you had to do is change the name. So we named it the Ambulatory Care Facility. The top floor was a mental health center. It was a 4-county operation, and it was a big deal. I mean, they had like 35, 40 employees up there, and they ran adult daycare centers and all kinds of things.
In 1978, the $3.2 million 4-story office building was completed. The hospital leaders undertook a major recruitment process to convince physicians to move to Princeton. Family doctors, such as the team at Princeton Family Physicians, opted for clinic space in the hospital instead of home offices.
Well, I can remember driving many times up to Rockford and having lunch or dinner with Faber and Meston, for instance, while they were still in the residency program. That's how you did it. You just got out there.
As it had for so long, the hospital would continue to stay at the forefront of technology and new practices, now fueled even more by the eager new doctors.
Obviously, the specialists welcomed us because their market shares depended upon the market share of the community hospital in which they work. So they were with open arms.
I think Faber and Meston, well, they were the first physicians to come to Princeton who were residency trained in family practice. And they really revolutionized things. The tests they ordered were different than the tests we had previously ordered. They ordered things like physical therapy for patients, and that was rarely done before they got here.
Things really changed rather quickly here, and the nurses learned it quickly.
As much as the first 40 years of Perry Memorial Hospital were full of challenges and a negative public perception, the next 20 years would be equally filled with growth and success. Hal Autry and his assistant Bill Spittler tag-teamed the effort to grow the hospital. The facilities had room for more than 150 patients and now the physicians to care for them. A growing array of quality services through the laboratory and radiology supported the needs of the clinics and the emergency room. And when a problem exceeded the scope of the Princeton Hospital, larger organizations were ready to take over.
Really, most transfers came about as a result of the physician availability. But there were times in our history when we didn't have an orthopedist. And when you don't have an orthopedist and somebody comes into the hospital from a car wreck and they got a couple fractures, well, you're going to transfer the patient. It's just that simple. A patient might be transferred on Saturday morning. It wouldn't be transferred on Monday morning because you got the right doctors there. It's just the way it is. Life in a small hospital. We only had one of everything, so.
Year after year, the hospital posted a positive bottom line. The volume of patients and the assets of the hospital were increasing along with efficiency. This left plenty of extra room for further investments. Between 1973 and 1998, Perry Memorial Hospital opened rural health clinics in Lamoille, Walnut, Ohio, Henry, Manlius, and Sheffield.
Those clinics were there. They were just manned by general practitioners. As these older general practitioners either retired, passed away, or become mentally incompetent, the idea was how do we fill those things? And so that's when the hospital started to get into the clinic business. But at that point, primary care was just really, really getting hard to access primary care providers because that was the cusp of the end of individuals going out and setting up their own practice.
As a result of growing reputation and financial stability, the leadership of Perry Memorial Hospital began to shift their focus to community outreach. Instead of waiting for sick patients to arrive for help, the organization began to work as a proactive resource for the community.
I sort of instilled the philosophy that a hospital is not just a building full of sick people. A lot of people look at the hospital and look down the hall, and I would say, no, look out the window. That's where the hospital's got to be, not down the hall. And so there was just a change in attitude going on. I think the hospital sort of came to the conclusion that, hey, we're responsible for the healthcare of the people of our service area. We got to get out there. We need to get to work. And we did. We did millions of things.
The hospital began hosting free screenings for such things as cholesterol or prostate cancer. Classes for diabetes and prenatal care started to fill major community needs. Programming and events cluttered the newspapers in an effort to connect with the community and educate on a new level. At the same time, cities began to take over more responsibilities for emergency services, and other area health organizations were coming into play, such as the health department, nursing homes, and home care services. Staff from Perry Memorial Hospital began forming connections and collaborating to offer more services than any could do on their own.
If there were 3 people in Bureau County, they got together to talk about health care, Perry Memorial Hospital needed to be one of those 3. We need to have clinics in every town. We need to be able to sit on the back of every fire truck in Bureau County and drink beer with those people. You know, you need to get in these towns and get as tight as you can. You want to make the hospital so integral to the community that people can't think of the community without thinking of the hospital. You do that in 1,000 different ways.
Opened in 1997, the Perry Plaza offered a way to support and connect healthcare organizations even further.
Mostly because of the laundry. We wanted the laundry facility. There were a lot more square feet over there than we needed. So we said, okay, let's start developing a space, and which we did, put the health department over there.
In 1992, the Perry Memorial Hospital Foundation became a new way to organize community outreach and a new way for people to leave larger donations to the hospital. Even as the hospital gained momentum and continued to expand, national trends were starting to shift. Advances in medical knowledge were changing healthcare, hastened by Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial insurance requirements. Over the course of the previous decades, the facilities and the staff at Perry Memorial Hospital had more than doubled to accommodate all of the services and patient needs. Baby deliveries peaked in 1982 with nearly 400 births. Similarly, the upward trend of inpatient care would also peak in the 1980s. The downward plunge would be far more sudden. The average patient length of stay was dropping drastically, and many services could be done without being admitted to the hospital at all. Fewer days in a hospital also meant less revenue, and the onset of laparoscopic procedures in the 1990s would cause the length of stay to plunge even further.
The quality of medicine and the delivery of medicine just kept going up because there was more and more knowledge.
They went from general surgery with 4 and 5 days for a gallbladder to laparoscopic surgery. You also started with CAT scans, went to an MRI, and you got diagnoses a lot quicker. Instead of monitoring a day, you'd run a scan and say, oh, they got appendicitis, or they have whatever.
And of course, the other thing was the correspondence via the internet, the very rapid. And of course, the first thing was, I guess, the fax machine, and the next thing was the internet, and the et cetera. All those were technological advances that impacted medicine as well as the changes in therapy, which impacted medicine. So the outcome overall was prolonged life for the American community. In 30 years, we gained almost a decade of life for both sexes.
Remarkable technology things were going on at that time that were dramatically reducing the need for people to go to the hospital.
By the end of the 20th century, Bill Spittler reported that the hospital had reduced its bed capacity to less than 80. More patients were beginning to rely on outpatient services, bringing with it significant financial effects.
We don't need 136 beds. And every year, the need for beds dropped further and further and further.
At the same time, Medicare and Medicaid programs were starting to tighten their belts.
The big gorilla in the room, and that's the government saying we don't want these people here.
Medicare didn't influence what you did way back then. You could pretty much do whatever you want because it was pretty standardized. But then when the insurance companies started coming in Medicare, they wanted to cut the cost, of course.
They literally said, here's your dollar amount. Get it in and under that price. If you don't, you lose money. So there was obviously pressure from the administrations of the hospitals, and not just this one, all the hospitals across the United States, to get people in and out, to have efficiency of care. A number of things as to the way both physicians and hospitals were paid changed dramatically.
when 80% of your patients are Medicare, you can bet it affected a few things, They made a big difference in how things were going to be. I mean, not just with Perry, but nationally, and how things were going to play out.
The Balanced Budget Act of 1997 severely cut payments from Medicaid, while Medicare continued a gradual process of scaling back. Rural hospitals were hurt across the country, but Perry Memorial Hospital made adjustments and continued to post a positive bottom line. The focus of healthcare was changing. It was no longer about treating illnesses. The purpose was now to prevent illnesses from starting altogether. And with fewer illnesses, the high-dollar services were shrinking. The extraordinary success of the 70s, 80s, and 90s was a unique time period for small, rural hospitals everywhere. Just as hospitals figured out how to deliver exceptional healthcare to everyone in need, the entire healthcare landscape shifted. For Perry Memorial Hospital and many other hospitals, the 20th century ended in disarray. Bill Spittler retired as president of Perry Memorial Hospital in 1999. In a matter of months, the hospital's stability and success came to a screeching halt.
The new guy came in. I walked out on Friday, and he came in on Monday. And Monday afternoon, the CFO I had came to I was mowing my yard. I'll never forget that. And he drove up, pulled up, and he came up to me and he said, "I just got fired. They said they were going to change the leadership." Well, during the next 3 months, something like 14 out of 18 department heads either got fired or resigned.
There were letters to the editor. I remember the mayor confronting the CEO on the footsteps of the municipal building. I remember 25, 35 for sale signs in the front yard of the CEO. All kinds of just absolutely crazy things. Many, many employees went and sought work elsewhere.
Employees were picketing the board meetings. The city council was suddenly trying to get involved in all kinds of things, and the hospital had closed down all of its clinics.
Changes in compliance and billing for state and federal regulations forced staff to scramble. The ever-decreasing inpatient needs were leaving departments overstaffed, and cuts to Medicare and Medicaid began hitting harder than ever. Hospitals across Illinois faced the tough decision of closing outlying clinics or eliminating services within the hospital. Finances continued to crumble while staff across the hospital feared for their jobs. After less than a year since so many changes had been made, the board realized the need for stability. As Perry Memorial Hospital approached the new millennium, one thing was for certain: healthcare would never be the same again. In only 20 years, the entire $1.4 trillion industry had completely shifted. In its wake, the leaders and staff at Perry Memorial Hospital were left picking up the pieces. The changes, however, were going to keep coming. The hospital had to be ready to adapt, to prepare for a new world of healthcare and a whole new series of challenges.